All this week, HuffPost Live is taking a deep dive into drugs and religion. We'll do a segment each day, having a different conversation about some aspect of faith and mind-altering substances. Today, native cultures. How do indigenous faiths use drugs, and what influence have psychedelics had on indigenous spiritual beliefs? Joining me to kick us off is Richard Miller, Professor of Pharmacology at Northwestern University Medical School and the author of Drugged, the Science and Culture Behind Psychotropic Drugs. Richard, thanks for being here. Can you give us a sense of how long humans have been using mind-altering substances for religious and spiritual purposes?
Hi, Josh. I think this goes back to the beginning of the human record, actually. I mean, if we look at the very earliest writings that we have, which are writings from Mesopotamia, which is about 2500 BC, we find people writing about things like opium. Then we have, if you go to ancient Greece, if you look at Homer, which is about 800 BC, and you look at the Odyssey, we have writings about psychotropic drugs there. Coming later and later, if you come to the Spanish, invasion of Central and South America, they encountered indigenous peoples at that time who were using various kinds of hallucinatory substances. On every continent, and for many, another example actually would be the Rig Veda, which is the very ancient, book of Hinduism. So it doesn't really matter what religion you look at or what continent or how early you go. You really find examples all over the place of the use of psychotropic drugs for mostly religious purposes. Also, they were used for medicinal purposes sometimes as well. But it's a very, very ancient practice, and I think that makes a lot of sense, actually.
Is it possible to disentangle the religious factors here from, I guess, what we would now call recreational drug use?
Yes, I think that it's very clear that in most of these ancient examples, the drugs were not being used for recreational purposes. That's something that was really, I would say, much more invented in the 19th century in Europe, and with the coming of Romanticism and that kind of philosophy. People in ancient times didn't really use drugs. They used them primarily for religious or possibly for medical purposes. I'll give you an example, if you like. If you look in ancient Greece at some of the ceremonies which they carried out, there's this very important ceremony which was carried out by a cult which worshipped the goddess Demeter and her daughter Persephone in Eleusis. They're called the Eleusinian Mysteries. And we know that in that particular case where people got together to worship these two goddesses, that they used a special drink, which we have good reason for thinking contained, hallucinogenic substances to help them, in their religious practices. If you look at the use of mushrooms in Siberia, which is Amanita muscaria, mushroom basically, is definitely used for religious purposes. When the Spanish came to Central America and discovered, the indigenous peoples using things like mescaline or psilocybin mushrooms, these were always for religious purposes. The recreational use of drugs is really something, generally speaking, is something that's happened in the last couple of hundred years, I would say.
And when you say recreational, when you say for spiritual and religious purposes, what does that actually look like?
Well, I mean, it can look like a number of things. I mean, very often you'd have a priest or a leader who would be conducting the services, and they might use the drugs to put themselves into some kind of, quasi-religious state. Or they might also distribute the drug to the other people who are engaged in the ceremony with them, so they would also be able to, participate in the kind of mystical thinking that the drug produces. I mean, this is the kind of thing that's very commonly found.
And just to give us some examples from elsewhere to show how widespread it was, can you speak to Zoroastrianism, to Hinduism in India, to Siberian shamanism? Just touch on a few of these.
Sure. I mean, the story in Siberia actually is very interesting. If you just give me 1 minute. There was a war in the 18th century between Sweden and Russia. And sometimes some of the Swedish soldiers were captured and incarcerated into camps in Siberia. There was one particular count who spent 12 years incarcerated in Siberia. And so he had a lot of opportunity to study the indigenous tribes in Siberia. And he discovered this very interesting phenomenon where the shaman in the tribe would eat this mushroom called Amanita muscaria. You know what that mushroom is. It's the red one with all the white spots on it that you see in Disney cartoons. Yeah, that's it. And that's very hallucinogenic, actually. And the really incredible thing about it that he observed was that people could get high by drinking the urine of somebody who had already eaten the mushroom. And then somebody could drink their urine and get high. You could go through about 5 people. Or you could drink the urine of a reindeer, actually, who'd eaten the mushroom. Then he sent that information back to Europe. And, people in 18th century Europe completely freaked out when they heard that people were drinking each other's urine to get high for these shamanistic purposes. So that would be like a very good example. And we think the same mushroom, actually, was probably a drug called soma, S-O-M-A, soma, which is discussed extensively in the Rig Veda, which of course is a Hindu book. There's a lot of evidence for that, and on and on. I mean, there are many examples. Actually, those two are good ones, I think.
Sure. I want to bring in another couple of voices into the conversation. Gary Perez is custodian of the Native American Church National Trust, and Bia Labate is a professor at the Center for Research and Postgraduate Studies in Social Anthropology and the author of multiple books on ayahuasca in South America. Thanks to both of you for being here, and all of you should feel free to jump into the conversation whenever you want to. But Gary, kick us off with peyote. A lot of us know on some level that Native Americans use it, but how exactly does the culture approach that psychedelic?
Well, the Native American Church, which was formed almost 100 years ago, it'll be celebrating 100 years here in 2018. I think that peyote was an answer to the colonialism that was taking place here in the United States. And I firmly believe in my heart and mind that the peyote is being used to deal with alcoholism, incarceration, colonialism on the individual's terms. It's really difficult to be Indian in America, especially if you live on a reservation. And peyote offers a temporary way of dealing with that, again, on your own terms.
Does peyote use for spiritual purposes not predate the invasion of North America, though?
It predates it by thousands of years. As a matter of fact, we have down here in Texas, we have a rock art painting that's anywhere from 2,000 to 4,000 years old that will show you exactly how to run the ceremony. In fact, it's how to run the ceremony. Also, it tells you the story of how peyote came to the people in the form of a creation story involving a deer that guided the sun and the rest of us out of the underworld, out of the darkness, and into the light. And that deer is our culture hero. And so it is. I like what Richard said. I think that it's very true that up until a few hundred years ago, even I think at the time of colonialism, that kind of changed. We were no longer worshiping the sacrificial deer. We were worshiping the sacrificial lamb. And things changed like that over the last 500 years regarding the use of peyote.
So what are the key tenets of Native American faiths, and how does peyote fit into them?
Wow. It's kind of hard to say. I would have to say that it varies from tribe to tribe. Even from individual to individual, because it's been adopted. It's a pan-Indian religion now, and that's the really difficult, hard question to answer without stepping on a tribe's toes.
Sure, I don't want to pretend that it's a homogenous thing to be Native American. I understand the nuances, but can you take, for example, a ritual, a common ritual, and just talk us through what a peyote ritual entails?
Well, it involves sitting up all night. It involves contemplation and prayer. It varies from tribe to tribe. And a lot of ceremonies tend to go as, how do I say this? It's about singing and praying. And whereas some church chapters, Daybreaker church chapters from Oklahoma preach the word of God in their ceremonies. They depend very much on scripture to raise the individual's awareness of the presence of God and the presence of the Lord Jesus Christ.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, if I may just interject,
Please.
how the very ancient use of something like peyote, which obviously precedes Christianity by a long time, when the Spanish came over here, they tried to ban the use of things like this. They went underground. And you can see now how the two things have sort of become fused together, how in a church, like you've just heard about, an ancient thing like peyote is now used in a celebration of Christianity. So that's a very interesting, fusion that has happened. I think that's very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, no, sure. So, Bia, let's just shift our gaze to South America. A lot of people have heard of ayahuasca. A lot of people probably haven't. Can you just explain what ayahuasca is and how it's traditionally used?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for the invite to be here. It's great to join this conversation. It's a very dear topic, and I think we need to give much more visibility to the spiritual dimension of drug use, because that is completely forgotten in this whole hysteria of the drug policy debate. And people forget that drugs originally have to do with identity and culture in profound and meaningful ways. So I think that the very topic of this program today is very welcomed. Now, I have dedicated many years of my life to study ayahuasca. I am Brazilian, and ayahuasca is from South America. Ayahuasca is getting pretty trendy nowadays. There's lots of U.S. Pop stars and famous personalities that have been taking ayahuasca, and TV shows, and even some vulgarization of the meaning of ayahuasca. But ayahuasca is a central part of indigenous shamanism all over through Amazon. Perhaps a counterpart that is less known and less talked about is the use of tobacco. Tobacco is a great partner of ayahuasca and also a great teacher master plant that is very influential. And it's another great example of how a plant is simply misunderstood and just trashed and stigmatized, despite it having a long history of use and based on traditions. So as Gary was saying, for the peyote, it's hard to make one single statement about what ayahuasca is, but I would also like to join him in what he said. I think that the use of these plants in indigenous cultures, it's related to the very idea of being human. Why are we here, and why are we people as such? What is the mystery behind being human, and what makes us breathe and have ideas about the future and the past and the self and time and space? So there's many indigenous mythological stories on how man came to Earth and how it came about, how it differentiated from animals, what is our relationship to the animal world, and also to all the rest of natural dimensions. So it's basically a central tenet of cosmological aspects of culture. In this regard, it's related to all main central areas of our cultural life, which is the idea of transmission of knowledge. So it's the opposite of this Western idea that you have to keep children away from drugs. You have to initiate children into using drugs according to their age and to their state in life. Sometimes it's also related to the very idea of becoming an adult, so to rites of passage. And it's related to socialization, celebration, to the production of arts, so to aesthetics, to the whole idea that you paint, you sing, you have visions, and these are, it's the opposite of the idea that this is counterculture. This is the way to teach culture. This is how we learn about our cultures and how we honor our ancestors and the invisible world. This idea that our world, the current world, is what is real. What we can see is a kind of minimum perception of all of the potentialities of human mind. Because actually, in many traditional cultures, there is the idea that the invisible world is present, and it's what actually guides the visible world. And these plants are a major mean and source to mediate this invisible world with the world that we are in and that we can see and talk and touch. So through using these plants, these several different cultures connect to this spiritual reality, to their ancestors. And also there's another big dimension which Richard also mentioned. He presented it as like kind of two independent modalities. I think they are related. I don't think he would disagree with that, which is the medicinal area. So a lot of these plants are related to practicing medicine in this regard. So particularly in ayahuasca rituals, you have a series of techniques. Also, some are overlapping with the Native American and peyote. So the idea of praying, of course, and in ayahuasca, it's very common to blow tobacco, and also to suck pathological elements. And then there's lots of variations. For example, in Colombia, they use musical instruments, and they do less diets. In Peru, they do more diets. And there's a whole spectrum. And just to round up this introduction of mine, I'd like to add that perhaps a little provocatively regarding the two previous presenters, that the idea of recreational drug use must also be revisited. Because I think that separating these categories in such rigid structures, for example, religious versus recreational, it's also a little bit reductionistic. I would say that traditionally, this use of drugs, they even blur the distinctions between these two dimensions, because traditionally things are organized in a different way. So what is medicine is also sacred. What is food, it's also sacred. The aesthetic dimension can be also spiritual. So I think that the very nature of these rituals is that they, in a way, implode our categories between sacred and profane, or these divisions, because it's more about unity and it's more about a whole and a dialogue. So I think that the use of these substances invite us to rethink our categories by which we classify the use of drugs, because having an aesthetic experience and creating art may fall exactly into the dimension of what we traditionally call religious. However, it is also part of this larger cosmological background.
Richard,
when I say recreational and medicinal, I mean it's all a matter of context, really. I mean that's how it's viewed in Western society, right? And we tend to put things in those categories, and that's the way things happen mostly in North America, in Western Europe. But that doesn't mean to say that in other cultures these things don't fuse together.
Right.
And perhaps we would benefit by looking at that. But when I say they're separate, I mean that in a Western context purely.
Richard, do you have a sense of whether or not they were more blended in other societies? Because it's a valid point. When Michelangelo is painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, is he engaged in a religious or an aesthetic or a recreational act? When a person meditates, if a secular person meditates, is it a religious act or is it a recreational act? The lines do get fuzzy.
They do get fuzzy, and I think that, as I said, it's only the idea of segregating these things so radically in the way that we do really is something that goes along with several other developments. The advance of technology, the impact of technology on our life, and part of that is the impact of medicine, modern medicine. These things all come, along with modern appreciation of science, which is a particular kind of culture which has been very influential in Western societies. That goes back to the 17th century.
I'd like to jump in on top of what Richard just said. I'm doing a lot of research in the rock art that we have out in West Texas, and when you look at it, it looks like it doesn't make any sense at all until you realize that it's mathematics, until you realize that it's geography, until you realize that it's astronomy, and until you realize that it took thousands of years to collect. And I have to say, on top of what our ancestors put up on that wall that just looks so enigmatic, that technology has finally caught up with the mind that painted that rock art 4,000 years ago. You know, I can't say on behalf of my ancestors why they decided to paint it the way that they did, but I know that it must have been some influence during ceremony that they must have come up with the idea. And when they did come up with the idea, the idea was rooted in science. It was rooted in math.
So
I'd have to say that.
Yeah, Gary. Modern scientists have done brain scans of people who are on, for example, psilocybin, magic mushrooms, and they've done brain scans of nuns who are praying, and the same parts of the brain kind of light up. People have profound spiritual experiences when they're on a trip. In modern scientific sense, we don't quite know what to make of that. But I take it that your ancestors would have thought that it's quite uncomplicated. When you're on a trip, you are gaining access to the spiritual realm. Is that fair?
I don't know. It's hard to say. I think that our ancestors worked really very hard to recreate their world in a very esoteric manner because, information was very valuable. It's how you maintained, how you negotiated your place in society. And I think that the rock art that they created was just so abstract that it kept the average native person from understanding what it was, so that you could have order within the society.
Richard, do you have a sense of what native cultures thought that they were doing, what indigenous faiths thought they were doing when they were taking these drugs? Am I correct in assuming that for them this was a portal into the spiritual world? This wasn't just about an experience in the here and now.
No, absolutely. This was a portal into the spiritual world. I mean, if we look at a lot of ancient writings, we see this very clearly, that the use of hallucinogenic drugs particularly was viewed as a way of being able to actually communicate with gods and spirits, deities of one kind or another, directly. It was specifically used in that way, particularly, I think, by the shamans and people that led these ceremonies. They absolutely had the view that when they took these substances, that would allow them to directly communicate with, the spiritual entities that really were important in the world. That's absolutely true.
Bia, you mentioned that ayahuasca is both used in very ancient, traditional, ritualistic ways, and that now it has a new sort of hip, there are Brooklyn parties and parties in West Hollywood where people take ayahuasca. Do you think that people are using it today in an attempt to sort of grasp some of the spiritual insights that people used it for traditionally?
I have studied in my PhD. My PhD is called Ayahuasca Mamancuna Merci Beaucoup, on the internationalization and diversification of Peruvian vegetalismo. So that's a kind of mixed shamanism and practice in Peru by native Peruvian and also mestizo Peruvian, which became quite hegemonic. This practice migrated to the whole world. So in one line, the Amazon went global and the globe went Amazonian, let's say. So shamans started to go traveling abroad on tours, and the famous so-called gringos, no offense, started to go to South America to drink ayahuasca. And as a young anthropologist back in the day, I was interested and intrigued in this phenomena and fascinated by this expansion, and was kind of wondering whether this was a legitimate cultural phenomenon or not. And I think that like any other cultural phenomena, you can't treat it in a reductionistic way. Basically, I think we need to have a balanced and critical view. It's not. I am not following those orthodox colleagues who thinks that all of this is pathetic and it's a kind of ridiculous gringo attempt to go native because they are lost in their cultures and don't have any other resources, and that everything is a plastic thing that they're imitating and they don't get a clue. I am not on that side of the continuum. Neither I am on that apologetic side, which is saying, well, this is the salvation of humankind, and ayahuasca is getting out of the Amazon to wake up the mind of the Westerners that we need to save our planet, that the Amazon is going to be destroyed, and this is the new psychedelic revolution, and now we're going to change consciousness as if, people drinking ayahuasca would stop poverty and hunger in Africa and Asia and throughout the whole world. So I think that it's a cultural phenomenon that is legitimate, like any others. We can't really say we are against this and we don't want this to happen. This is happening. I think we have to think of ways to mitigate potential conflicts and bad consequences on both sides. So I think we have to work on the front of information, harm reduction, and also try to understand what's going on. And going back to your question, why are people using ayahuasca? I don't think it's ayahuasca parties. I don't know where you got that from.
Oh, definitely there are ayahuasca parties. Absolutely, yes. They're not uncommon, but they still have a shamanistic ritual to them. I don't mean like a rave party. I mean people who sit around and they consume it, and there is a spiritual guide, and they spend a whole night together. This is something that is not uncommon.
Party then?
What's that?
Why do you call it party then?
Because it's a grouping of people coming together having fun.
The fun part is relative. If you do a lot of vomiting and meditation on your own.
I didn't say it was my idea of fun, but it's someone's idea of fun. Richard, just wrap us up here with, I want to get a sort of overview. Would it be possible, would indigenous faiths be indigenous faiths in the way that we currently understand them in the absence of drugs?
Well, they clearly wouldn't be. I mean, I think actually, and this is something that's been widely discussed by anthropologists for years, that drugs probably played a major role in actually shaping these religions originally, because, if you think about man thousands of years ago experimenting with different crops, different plants, he would have tried some of these things, and they would have produced effects on his cognitive experiences, which he didn't really understand in a modern technical way. They would have been certainly interpreted as mystical. And I think it's almost certainly the case that drugs like ayahuasca, like different kinds of mushrooms and other kinds of hallucinogenic drugs did actually play a role in the shaping of what we now see as modern religions that indigenous peoples have these days, which are really the heirs to, other religions that people have practiced for thousands of years. So I think the role of these substances is actually primary. It's not a secondary thing at all.
Richard, Gary and Bia, thank you so much for being with us. Wonderful to talk to you. Come back at 4:15 p.m. Eastern tomorrow when we dive into Eastern faiths and mind-altering substances. In the meantime, stay tuned for more conversations coming up here on HuffPost Live.